Hello, we are here today with Laura Johnson. She is the pollinator specialist and agronomist at UVM, and we're going to talk a little bit about what seasonality, how it's affecting the pollinators and what they need for their habitat and food. And this is to help us as grazers think about that, keep that in mind while we're going throughout the grazing season.
Yeah, that's a great question. And generally, worldwide, there is insect decline, and insects, contribute to our ecological landscape, and we are part of that ecological landscape. And they provide pollination services for a lot of the foods that we eat, and also some of the food that your livestock might eat. So, in thinking about if you have mixed stands of legumes and grasses in your pastures, which are, ideal for providing and satisfying nitrogen needs for your pasture grasses, and also enhance the nutritional diet of your livestock. If you allow some of those legumes to flower, they provide food resources for pollinators like bees and butterflies. And by allowing those insects to pollinate those flowers, many of those are, dependent on insect-mediated pollination in order to produce seed, which further improves the longevity of the diversity in your field. So, certain clover species can reproduce by stolons in addition to seed, but short-term perennials like red clover really rely on either you reseeding and buying seed, or you can let the pollinators do it for you. So they help contribute to the diversity of your landscape. Yeah. So a lot of pollinators, beetles, but bees will be in either in woody stems, hollow stems, or like raspberry stems. Sumac provides a really nice nesting habitat for certain bee and beetle species. You might also find them under the bark of trees, so thinking about your field margins. Also rock piles around. Well, a lot of folks in New England have old rock piles in their woods and landscapes, and bumblebees are known to nest in the cracks and crevices of those areas. Also, most bee species nest in the ground, so about 70-75% of bee species will nest in the soil. So a lot of those pollinators will be just underground during the winter months and waiting for snow to melt, and when the time is right, they'll emerge. The bees and other pollinators will coincide with the flowering of plants and in shrubs during the springtime, so that they can feed on pollen and nectar that those resources provide. But when you're mowing, they're going to disperse. But one thing to think about in terms of maybe your mowing pattern, if you can, is to mow outwards. I know, starting from the center and mowing outwards, so that the kind of escape route is to the field margins, instead of mowing around and around into the middle where you kind of trap everything. So I think the rule of thumb that I've been coming across is between 1% to 2.5% of your total production area is a good rule of thumb in terms of providing space for flowering plants and habitat for insects, and then making sure that whatever amount of land that is in your landscape, that it's kind of dispersed in patches, because certain insects only travel maybe a few hundred feet, so they need to be able to kind of find those islands of resources, and might not be able to make it across an entire field if they're a particular species. But some species of bees can fly for miles, so it really breaking it up and kind of making a mosaic throughout your landscape is important. But I would say 1 to 2.5% of your production area use that as a rule of thumb for habitat. Yeah. Well, different insects have different types of mouth parts. So things like bees will and butterflies have tongues, so they can like reach into flowers in order to access resources. And even within those species, they have different lengths of tongues. So like different clover species, like red clover as compared to white clover, their floret size changes. So white clover has a more shallow floret than red clover. So short-tongued bees might be able to access white clover, whereas only long-tongued bees can access red clover. So there's like some very distinct differences like that, and that's just one example. But then things like beetles don't have tongues, so they need kind of open access flowers like black-eyed Susans or Queen Anne's lace, or anything that doesn't have that kind of tubular flower that they can just land on and be able to access pollen and nectar resources. That's a really good question. And yeah, it's during kind of the latter half of July and early August, there's typically a floral dearth period, so there's not a lot of pollen and nectar resources. And if you've got managed honeybees, you might even need to be feeding your bees during that time, or they might be surviving off of resources that they've gathered through the season up until that point, because there's not a lot going on in the environment that provides for them. But in terms of like wild pollinators and wild bees, they'll also be limited in those resources as well. And I'm thinking about like certain crops that might not typically be thought of as insect attractive, like field corn or sweet corn, which is wind pollinated, but even and other grass species that might be heading out at that time do provide some pollen for insects during kind of those less resource-rich periods of the season. Yeah, I think that, again, thinking about those field margins and maybe along your fence lines where, yes, you have to keep it cleared to a certain extent to maintain the power of your fence, but, where you've got goldenrods and asters that might be far enough away that it's not interrupting the electrical charge or anything, leaving those until after a hard frost is a really good idea, because they provide really valuable late season resources for things like bumblebees or species like bumblebees. You'll actually start to see next year's queens, next year's bees out and about during these latter months of the year, and they need to feed in order to be able to survive the winter. So if they don't have the food resources in their landscape, then they're not going to fatten up pretty much for the winter and be able to survive. So leaving those late blooming flowers as long as you can is important. And then also, if you maybe think about only cutting a third of the total kind of maybe shrubby or kind of goldenrod, aster landscape that you have, because there's going to be other types of insects nesting in those plants as well over the winter.
This video is brought to you by the Vermont Grass Farmers Association and the National Grazing Lands Coalition. It is partially funded by a USDA NRCS agreement.